America often sees itself as a new nation. It was born from revolution, a clean break from the old ways of Europe. We think of the founding fathers as inventors, creating a government from scratch in the late 1700s. They were building something the world had never seen before. This story is powerful. It is the story of a nation of immigrants leaving behind ancient quarrels and rigid social classes for a land of opportunity. The United States, with its skyscrapers and digital highways, feels like the very definition of modern. It seems to look only forward, not back. But this image, of a country without a past, is not the whole story. If you look closely, you can see the faint outlines of a much older world. America's foundations were not laid in an empty field. They were built with stones carried across the Atlantic, stones quarried from the castles and cathedrals of medieval Europe. The ideas that we hold most dear, liberty, justice, and the rule of law, did not spring to life in Philadelphia in 1776. They are the result of a long, slow journey that began centuries earlier, in a time we often call the Dark Ages. To understand America, you have to understand where its ideas came from. After the Roman Empire fell, Europe entered a long period of change and uncertainty. Life was difficult and often dangerous. People needed protection. This need gave rise to a system called feudalism. Kings and powerful lords granted land to lesser nobles, or vassals, in exchange for loyalty and military service. At the bottom were the serfs, who worked the land and were tied to it. It was a world built on duties and obligations, a pyramid of power with the king at the top. This feudal world seems very different from our own. It was a society based on hierarchy, not equality. There was no single, powerful central government like we have today. Instead, power was spread out among many different lords, each ruling their own small territory. The idea of a unified nation was still a long way off. Yet it was within this fragmented and often violent world that the first seeds of American democracy were planted. The story of America doesn't begin in the New World, but in the heart of the Old. The medieval world was not a free one, but it was not a world of absolute power either. Even kings had limits. Their authority was constantly challenged by powerful nobles and the church. This ongoing struggle for power created cracks where the ideas of liberty could take root. Over time, traditions developed that said even a king must follow the law. This was a radical concept. It meant that no ruler was above the rules that governed everyone else. This principle, the rule of law, would become a cornerstone of American government, a fundamental belief that protects citizens from the whims of those in power. A major turning point came in England in the year 1215. A group of angry barons forced King John to sign a document called the Magna Carta. This great charter was not a declaration of rights for all people. It was mostly an agreement to protect the privileges of the nobles, but it contained principles that would echo through the centuries. It stated that the king could not take property or imprison a free man without a proper legal process. It also suggested that a king could not raise taxes without the consent of his leading men, an early version of no taxation without representation. Alongside the rule of law, another important idea began to grow: representative government. Kings needed money and support to rule, especially for wars. To get it, they started calling councils of nobles and church leaders to advise them and approve new taxes. In England, this practice evolved into Parliament. These early assemblies were not democratic. They represented only the wealthiest and most powerful people in the kingdom. But they established a vital tradition that rulers should consult with at least some of their subjects and that a community should have a voice in its own governance. While nobles and kings wrestled for power, something new was happening in the towns. As trade slowly returned to Europe, merchants and craftsmen formed guilds and built bustling urban centers. These towns became islands of freedom in a feudal sea. They operated with their own charters and laws, creating early forms of capitalism based on contracts, private property, and the pursuit of profit. This new economic energy, combined with the political ideas of limited government and representation, created a powerful brew. It was this mix of ideas that English colonists would eventually carry with them across the ocean. When English settlers sailed for America in the 1600s, they did not leave their history behind. They packed their traditions and beliefs along with their tools and supplies. They were Englishmen, and they brought with them the rights of Englishmen. They believed in the principles of the Magna Carta. They expected to have a say in their own government, just as Parliament had a say in England. They established colonial assemblies, like the Virginia House of Burgesses, which were modeled on the English Parliament. These bodies gave them a place to debate local issues, and, most importantly, control their own taxes. The vast and varied landscape of North America shaped how these old traditions developed. The colonies grew in different directions, creating distinct economies and societies. In the South, the warm climate and fertile soil led to a plantation economy based on growing cash crops like tobacco and rice. This system relied heavily on the labor of enslaved Africans and created a society dominated by a wealthy, land-owning class, much like the aristocracy of old Europe. It was a world that prized hierarchy and tradition, even as it was built on the new realities of the American continent. In New England, the story was different. The rocky soil and colder climate were not suited for large-scale agriculture. Instead, the economy was built on small farms, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The towns were the center of life. Here, communities gathered in town meetings to make decisions for themselves, a direct and local form of self-government. This society was more egalitarian than the South. It was shaped by Puritan religious beliefs which emphasized community, hard work, and literacy. It was a world that looked a lot like the bustling, independent towns of late medieval Europe. These different colonial experiences all drew from the same well of English tradition, but they adapted it in unique ways. Whether in the aristocratic South or the commercial North, the colonists held fast to certain core beliefs. They believed in their right to property, the importance of the rule of law, and the necessity of representation. When the British government began to challenge these long-held rights in the mid-1700s, it set the stage for a conflict. The colonists felt that the king and parliament were breaking a sacred centuries-old contract. The very traditions that had bound them to England would now give them the reasons to break away. The American Revolution was not just a fight for new ideas, it was a fight to preserve old ones. When colonists shouted, "No taxation without representation," they were not inventing a new slogan. They were echoing a principle that went back to the Magna Carta and the long struggle between English kings and their people. They believed that the British government, by imposing taxes like the Stamp Act without the consent of their colonial assemblies, was violating their fundamental rights as Englishmen. The Revolution in many ways was a conservative act, an attempt to restore a balance that they felt had been lost. After winning their independence, the new nation's leaders faced a monumental task: to create a government for themselves. They gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to write the Constitution. They were well-read men, familiar with the thinkers of the Enlightenment, but they also drew heavily on their English heritage. The Constitution is a masterpiece of medieval political thought, updated for a new world. The idea of checks and balances, with power divided between the president, Congress, and the courts, was designed to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful, a direct lesson from the long struggle against absolute monarchy. The new government also enshrined the protection of private property, a concept that had its roots in feudal landholding and the commercial life of medieval towns. The Bill of Rights, added shortly after the Constitution was ratified, guaranteed freedoms like the right to a trial by jury, another practice inherited from English common law. These founders were not tearing everything down. They were carefully selecting the best stones from the old structure and using them to build something new and more durable, a republic that could stand the test of time. Of course, there were fierce debates about the nation's future. Alexander Hamilton envisioned an America with a strong central government and a bustling economy based on manufacturing and finance, much like Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, feared concentrated power and hoped for a nation of independent farmers, each with their own land. This argument, between a commercial future and an agrarian one, reflected the old tensions between the town and the countryside that had shaped Europe for centuries. The path America chose would be a blend of both visions, a compromise that continues to define the nation. As America grew through the 1800s, it transformed into an industrial powerhouse. Railroads stitched the continent together, and great cities rose from the plains. It seemed to be moving further and further away from its European origins. Yet, even as the nation modernized, its medieval foundations remained firmly in place. The legal system continued to rely on common law, a tradition of judge-made precedents that began in the courts of English kings. When you walk into an American courtroom today, the rituals, the language, and the core principles of justice are part of a conversation that has been going on for nearly 1,000 years. The structure of American government still carries the imprint of its medieval past. Congress, with its two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate, is a direct descendant of the two houses of the English Parliament. The very idea of a legislature that represents the people, holds the power of the purse, and serves as a check on executive authority is a legacy of those early councils of nobles who dared to challenge their king. The rights we often take for granted, from freedom of speech to protection from arbitrary arrest, are the fruits of a long and difficult struggle that began long ago. This connection is not just a historical curiosity. It shows that American institutions are not fragile inventions. They are part of a deep, resilient tradition. They have survived civil war, economic depression, and immense social change because their roots go deep into the soil of Western civilization. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the strength and the complexity of our government. It reminds us that the quest for freedom and justice is a long one, and that we are participants in a story that started long before our nation was born. In the end, America is not simply new or old. It is both. It is a bridge between the past and the present, a place where ancient ideas found new life and new expression. The nation's identity is a unique blend of revolutionary hope and deep-seated tradition. It is the product of Enlightenment ideals and medieval struggles, of a forward-looking spirit and a reverence for the rule of law. The story of America is the story of how the quest for a more perfect union is built upon the enduring foundations of a distant and surprisingly familiar past.